The spit hit Bumpy Johnson's shoe, and something invisible shattered. Not glass, not silence, but the sense of safety everyone on that street thought they had. For one frozen second, Harlem forgot how to breathe. Bumpy stood there, perfectly. Still, the noise of the street draining away like water down a gutter. He felt it before he looked the warmth, the humiliation, the intention behind it. This wasn't drunken stupidity. This was hate, delivered carefully, in public, for witnesses. People's hearts began to race. Shopkeepers felt their stomachs drop. Mothers pulled their children closer without knowing why. Men who had survived shootings, stabbings, prison, suddenly felt afraid not of what would happen now, but of what would happen later. Because everyone knew one truth about Bumpy Johnson. He never reacted the way you expected. Harlem lived under pressure in those days. Racism pressed from the outside. Poverty pressed from within. Holding it all together was a fragile balance of respect. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was an unspoken line. Cross it, and consequences followed. Quietly, permanently. The men walking toward him didn't care about that line. They were strangers. Outsiders. Their leader walked with forced confidence, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a need to dominate. He had heard Bumpy's name whispered like a warning. He wanted to prove something to his followers, to himself, to the city. When he leaned forward and spat, his lips curled in satisfaction. Bumpy looked down at his shoe. Slowly, the moment. Stretched so long it hurt. His men waited for the signal, a nod, a raised hand, anything. Violence sat coiled in their chests, begging to be released. But Bumpy felt something colder than anger. He felt disappointment. Not in the man, but in the inevitability of what now had to happen. He reached into his pocket and removed a handkerchief. His hands were steady, too steady. He wiped his shoe clean, careful not to rush, careful not to look rushed. When he looked up, his eyes weren't burning. They were empty. That emptiness scared people more than rage ever could. Bumpy smiled, not warmly, not kindly. It was the smile of a man who had already made a decision and didn't need to explain it. He stepped aside and let them pass. The wizard laughed, nervous, loud. His followers joined in, relief spilling out of them. They told themselves they had one, that the stories were exaggerated, that Bumpy Johnson was just another man. Behind them, Harlem remained silent. That night, no sirens screamed, no guns fired, no bodies dropped. And that was what made it terrifying. Because when Bumpy Johnson chose silence, it meant he was giving fate time to catch up. Silence spread faster than any rumor by nightfall. Everyone who mattered in Harlem knew what had happened. Not because Bumpy told them, but because he didn't. That was the warning. When Bumpy Johnson wanted blood, the streets heard shouting. When he wanted justice, they heard nothing at all. Men gathered in back rooms and spoke in low voices. Cards went unplayed. Drinks went untouched. People replayed the moment again and again in their minds, the spit, the pause, the smile. Each time, it felt worse. Bumpy sat alone that night. Lights low, jacket still on. He hadn't changed his shoes. He hadn't thrown them away. The disrespect clung to him, not physically, but emotionally. Not his shame, but his obligation. In his world, unanswered humiliation didn't fade. It rotted. A knock came at the door, then another. Loyal men filtered in quietly, waiting for instructions that didn't come. Bumpy listened more than he spoke. Names were mentioned. License plates, addresses outside Harlem. Meetings whispered about in places that hated the dark. Bumpy absorbed it all. No rush, he finally said. Those two words sent a chill through the room. The next day, strange things began to happen. The men in robes noticed shadows where there hadn't been any before. Familiar streets felt unfamiliar. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. Car followed them once, then vanished. A phone rang late at night. No one spoke on the other end. Fear crept in slowly. Like a sickness you don't feel until it's too late. The Grand Wizard laughed it off at first, called it paranoia, told his followers that Harlem was bluffing, that Bumpy Johnson was a myth, built on exaggeration. But even as he spoke, his eyes darted to windows. His hands shook when he lit cigarettes. 2 days passed. Then came the first real sign. A package was delivered to a safe house. No return address, no note. Inside was something. Small and personal. Something only one man would recognize. It wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. It was proof. Proof that someone had been close. Too close. The laughter stopped after that. Police sensed movement, but couldn't grasp it. Informants suddenly went quiet. Tips dried up. It was as if Harlem had closed its mouth as one. Officers later said it felt like chasing a ghost that wanted to be seen but only on its own terms. Bumpy remained calm, almost gentle. He checked on neighbors, helped settle disputes, paid for groceries. To outsiders, he looked unchanged. To those who knew him, the difference was terrifying. He was patient, and patience meant planning. By the second night, the Grand Wizard couldn't sleep. Every sound felt like footsteps. Every car door felt final. He started carrying notes in his pocket, addresses, names, reminders, little anchors to reality. Proof that he was still in control. He wasn't. Harlem wasn't angry anymore. It was waiting, and somewhere in that waiting, a message was being written, one that wouldn't need many words. And one the police would never forget when they finally found it. Fear changes how people move. By the third day, the Grand Wizard no longer walked with confidence. His shoulders stayed tight. His eyes kept scanning reflections in windows, puddles, car doors, anything that might reveal who was behind him. The city felt closer now, narrower, like the walls were inching inward. He told his men to stay together. That only made it worse. Groups attract attention, and attention in Harlem had a price. Bumpy Johnson never followed directly. He didn't need to. Harlem itself did the watching for him. A bartender noticed who ordered but didn't drink. A cab driver remembered an address that didn't fit the accent. A woman leaning out a window clocked the same car passing twice. None of them spoke to police. None of them spoke loudly at all. They spoke to Harlem. Information moved hand to hand, word to word, without paper, without phones. By the time it reached Bumpy, it was already clean. Verified. Precise. He listened, nodded once, and dismissed everyone. No instructions, no threats, just understanding. The Grand Wizard felt it that evening. A shift. The city went quiet around him, the way animals go quiet before a storm. He ducked into a bar he'd never entered before, hoping noise would protect him. It didn't. Conversations softened. His eyes followed him without turning heads. He left his drink untouched. Outside, footsteps echoed behind him, then stopped. When he turned, no one was there. His breath came faster. Anger tried to replace fear, but it couldn't hold. That night, he moved locations, then again and again. Each place felt less safe than the last. Every room smelled unfamiliar. Every bed felt temporary. He started writing things down, obsessively, names, dates, reminders, folding the paper and stuffing it into his pocket like a talisman. Somewhere across the city, Bumpy Johnson sat calmly, listening to reports come in. Not about movements, but about emotions. Panic, arrogance, cracking. Men arguing. Loyalty thinning. That was the hunt. No chase, no sirens. Just pressure. Grand Wizard made a mistake on the fourth night. A small one. He trusted someone who smiled too quickly. He spoke too freely, trying to reclaim control, trying to convince himself he still had it. The moment the words left his mouth, regret followed. Harlem heard. What happened next wasn't loud. Neighbors later said they heard nothing unusual. No screams, no shots. Just a car idling too long, then driving away. The city exhaled. When the police were finally called, it wasn't because of chaos, it was because of stillness. Something was wrong enough to be noticed, but quiet enough to be deliberate. They found him alone. No signs of a struggle that made sense. No witnesses who saw anything. No fingerprints that helped. Just a man who had looked powerful days earlier, now reduced to a question no one could answer. Then an officer reached into the pocket and pulled out the folded note. The smell hit first. Hardened men turned away. One gagged. Another swore softly and stepped back. Whatever message had been left behind wasn't meant for the victim, was meant for everyone else. And suddenly, the spit on Bumpy Johnson's shoe made terrible, unavoidable sense. The note sat in the officer's hand like it didn't belong in the world. It was damp, stained, folded too many times, as if the man who carried it had kept checking it, needing to feel it was still there. When the officer tried to open it, his fingers hesitated, not from professionalism, but from instinct. Something about it felt wrong. The smell hadn't faded. Police had seen violence before. They had worked murders that stayed with them long after the paperwork was filed. This was different. This wasn't rage. This wasn't chaos. This was intention pressed into flesh and paper. One officer stepped outside and vomited onto the curb. Another stared at the wall, blinking hard, trying to slow his breathing. Inside the room, silence settled again. The note itself didn't say much. It didn't need to. No long confession, no manifesto. Just a few words written with care, the kind of care that suggested patience rather than anger. A message that turned the stomach, not because it was graphic, but because it was personal. The man had known exactly what was coming. Detectives looked at each other without speaking. No one needed to say the name. Bumpy Johnson hung in the air like smoke. Not a suspect, not officially, but a presence. A shadow behind every unanswered question. They searched the room again. Nothing out of place. No signs of forced entry. No neighbors who heard anything useful. Doors locked, windows intact. Whoever had been there hadn't rushed. They hadn't panicked. They had taken their time. That terrified the police more than brutality ever could. Word spread quickly through the department. Officers whispered about the note in hallways. Veterans warned rookies not to ask too many questions. One detective muttered, "This wasn't a killing. This was a lesson." Up in Harlem, people heard about it differently. They didn't talk about the body. They didn't talk about the note. They talked about the spit. About how a man had crossed a line he didn't understand. Mothers nodded grimly. Old men shook their heads, not in approval, but in certainty. Bumpy Johnson had responded exactly as expected. By doing almost nothing. Bumpy himself never commented. When asked indirectly, he smiled politely and changed the subject. He attended community meetings. He paid hospital bills. He walked the streets like any other day. If there was weight on his shoulders, he didn't show it. That restraint made the story grow. People added details, changed details, made it darker, sharper, more frightening. The truth didn't matter anymore. The meaning did. And the meaning was clear to anyone paying attention. Its public humiliation demanded private consequences. The police closed the case without closing it. Files went into cabinets that wouldn't be opened again. Leads went cold without ever being followed. Some things were safer left unexplained, because the note wasn't just evidence, it was a warning. And everyone from law enforcement to the streets understood exactly who it was meant for. After that, Harlem moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just aware. The way people walk after hearing thunder in the distance, knowing the storm, has already decided where it will strike next. No one celebrated what happened. There were no cheers, no smiles, no boasting. Violence that carries meaning rarely needs applause, simply reshapes the ground it touches. The police presence increased. For a while, patrol cars idled longer on corners. Detectives asked questions they already knew wouldn't be answered. Harlem responded the same way it always did, with silence that felt almost polite. Doors closed gently. Faces stayed neutral. Memories became selective. Bumpy Johnson's name never appeared in any report. It didn't have to. Everyone understood the math. Disrespect plus time equaled consequence. That equation had been written long before that day on 125th Street. Among hate groups, something shifted. Loud voices quieted. Trips into Harlem stopped entirely. The city was no longer a stage, it was a boundary. The story of the spit traveled farther than the truth ever could, stripped down to its core lesson. Humiliation had a cost. Bumpy didn't change. That was the most unsettling part. He didn't demand recognition. He didn't tighten his grip. If anything, he softened in public. He helped families, mediated disputes, sponsored local events. To outsiders, it looked like contradiction. To Harlem, it made perfect sense. Power that has to announce itself is already weakening. Years later, people would still tell the story, usually in whispers. The details varied, some said. The note said this, others swore it said that. Some made it darker. Some made it symbolic. But every version ended the same way, with Bumpy wiping his shoe. That image mattered more than the note, more than the body, more than the police reaction. Because it captured everything about how power truly worked in Harlem. You could insult him, you could test him, but once you crossed him, you wouldn't hear the response coming. You would only feel it too late to undo anything. That was the lesson. Passed down, not as a threat, but as history. And in Harlem, history had a long memory. Years passed, Harlem changed. Buildings rose, names faded, faces disappeared. But the story didn't die. Stories like that never do. They sink into the pavement. They wait. Old men told it on stoops late at night, lowering their voices even when no one else was around. Not out of fear, but respect. They didn't tell it to glorify violence. They told it to explain order. To explain why certain lines stayed uncrossed long after the men who drew them were gone. Police recruits heard fragments of it in training, always secondhand, always unfinished. Veterans would stop mid-sentence and shake their heads, as if finishing it out loud might invite something back into the room. Files stayed thin. Questions stayed unanswered. And Bumpy Johnson. He carried on. He aged. He laughed. He argued. Protected. He walked Harlem the same way he always had, like a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The power wasn't in what he did. It was in what people believed he was capable of. That belief outlived him. Long after Bumpy was gone, long after the names involved meant nothing to most people, one part of the story always remained untouched. The moment that started it all. A man choosing public humiliation, another man choosing patience. Because, in Harlem, the most dangerous response was never anger. It was restraint. And that was why, decades later, people still remembered the spit. But no one ever forgot what followed. Some stories end when the body is found. This one didn't. It lived on in how people behaved afterward, and who chose not to speak, and who chose not to come back. In the quiet understanding that certain lines once crossed could never be uncrossed. Bumpy Johnson never needed statues or headlines. His legacy wasn't written in newspapers. It was written in restraint, in the pause after an insult, in the silence after a threat, in the way an entire city learned when to stop pushing. That's how real power survives time. If this story made you uncomfortable, it was supposed to. These aren't fairy tales. They're warnings preserved as history. And history doesn't care whether you believe it tonally, whether you learn from it. If you want more true stories where one moment changes everything, where respect and consequence collide in the shadows, make sure you stay here. Because the next story starts the same way this one did. With someone making a mistake they can't take back.